I'm Rose, 33 female. I live in a city I built for myself, in a home that I earned, surrounded by a quiet peace that I fought for every single day for 15 years. I run a successful software company that helps small businesses streamline their logistics, a problem I became intimately familiar with when I had nothing but problems of my own. My life is orderly, my future is secure, and the ghosts of my past have, until recently, remained exactly where I left them, in the rearview mirror of a beat-up 1998 sedan. This is the story of how the two people who were supposed to be my foundation decided I wasn't worth the ground I stood on, and how, 15 years later, they came asking me to build them a new house on the foundation I had laid for myself. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. The silence in our house was a language I had learned to speak fluently. It was a heavy, thick silence, the kind that fills a space when words have been deemed too expensive to waste on you. My childhood was an exercise in understanding this language, learning the different dialects of my father Arthur's stony glares and my mother Helen's pointedly turned back. I was the inconvenient child, the one who didn't fit the mold they had so carefully crafted. My younger sister, Lily, 5 years my junior, was their masterpiece. Where I was quiet and studious, Lily was bubbly and social. Where my dark hair and serious eyes mirrored a grandparent they'd disliked, Lily's blonde curls and bright smile were a perfect reflection of my mother in her youth. They doted on her, celebrated her every minor achievement, and smoothed over her every mistake. I, on the other hand, was a project to be managed, a problem to be endured until a solution presented itself. The solution, it turned out, was my 18th birthday. For months leading up to it, the air in the house had been different. There was a tension, an unspoken countdown that I could feel but not comprehend. My parents started speaking in hypotheticals that felt more like pronouncements. When a person is an adult, they have to carry their own weight, my father would say to no one in particular while watching TV. The world doesn't owe anyone a free ride, my mother would add, sorting through mail at the kitchen table. I was a good student, never got into trouble, and worked a part-time job at the local library. I was saving what I could for community college, assuming that was the expected path. I tried to talk to them about it once, showing them a brochure for a computer science program. My father glanced at it with disdain. "That's a waste of money for you," he'd grunted. "You need to be realistic. Get a full-time job at that library. Maybe work your way up to manager in 20 years. The morning of my birthday was eerily normal. My mother made pancakes, but not for me. They were for Lily, who had a school event. My father was in the garage, fixing a lawnmower, the sound of his grunting and the clanging of metal a familiar soundtrack to our joyless home. No one said happy birthday. It wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. I had learned long ago not to expect affection, but the deliberate erasure of my existence on that particular day was a new, sharper kind of pain. I went to school, came home, and did my homework. I ate a sandwich alone in the kitchen while my mother and Lily discussed outfits for an upcoming dance. That evening, I packed a small duffel bag. It wasn't a conscious decision to leave, more like an instinct for self-preservation. I packed a few changes of clothes, my toothbrush, the worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that a kind teacher had given me, and the $743 I had painstakingly saved from my library job, hidden in a sock. At precisely 10 p.m., my father called me into the living room. My mother was there, sitting on the couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. Lily was conveniently upstairs, music blaring from her room. My father stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed over his thick chest. He had been a construction foreman his whole life, and he carried an air of unshakable, brutish authority. "Rose," he began, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "As of today, you are legally an adult. Your mother and I have fulfilled our obligation to raise you." I stood there, my heart starting to pound a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. I clutched the strap of the duffel bag slung over my shoulder, the weight of it suddenly feeling like the only thing grounding me. "We've given you a roof over your head and food on the table for 18 years," my mother added, her voice thin and reedy. "We feel we have done our duty." My father gestured towards the front door. "The world is a tough place. It's time you learned that. Firsthand, from this moment on, you are on your own." I stared at them, trying to find a flicker of something, a hint of a joke, a sign of hesitation, anything. There was nothing. Their faces were set like stone. It was a business transaction. They were closing a long, unprofitable account. I asked the only question that came to mind, my voice barely a whisper. "Where am I supposed to go?" My father shrugged. "That's your problem to solve now. You're an adult." I didn't cry. I didn't beg. A strange, cold calm washed over me. The years of emotional neglect had been a training ground for this exact moment. I was being amputated from this family, and the shock was so profound that the pain hadn't registered yet. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked to the door. I didn't look back. As I stepped onto the porch, I heard the click of the deadbolt behind me. It was a sound of finality, a period at the end of a sentence I had been forced to read my entire life. The porch light switched off, plunging me into darkness. It was done. I was 18. I was homeless. And I was, for the first time, truly and utterly alone. The cold of that first night seeped into my bones. The world outside my family's locked door was vast and indifferent. My only possession of any real value was the old, rusted sedan my grandfather had left me, a car my parents had constantly threatened to sell for scrap. Now, it was my home. I drove to the 24-hour supermarket parking lot, found a spot in a dimly lit corner, and reclined the driver's seat. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the car, every passing headlight, sent a jolt of fear through me. The click of that deadbolt echoed in my mind, a sound that would become the rhythm of my nightmares for years to come. The first few weeks were a blur of survival. I showered at a cheap 24-hour gym I joined with my savings, lived off protein bars and water, and used the library's Wi-Fi to search for jobs and a room I could afford. My part-time library job wasn't enough, so I found another one, washing dishes at a greasy diner late at night. My days became a grueling cycle. Work at the library, drive to the diner, work until 2 a.m., then find a safe place to park and sleep for a few hours before it started all over again. I was exhausted, constantly looking over my shoulder, but a strange thing was happening. A tiny, fragile seed of resilience was beginning to sprout in the barren soil of my despair. For the first time in my life, no one was watching me with disapproval. No one was sighing with disappointment when I walked into a room. My survival depended solely on me, and with each day I didn't starve, with each night I made it through safely, that seed grew stronger. The $743 dwindled alarmingly fast. Gas, gym membership, food, it all added up. I learned to be ruthlessly frugal. I became an expert at finding free Wi-Fi, at knowing which gas stations had the cleanest bathrooms, and at making a single cup of coffee last for hours at the diner to stay warm. The car was my sanctuary and my prison. It was where I studied for my GED, where I cried in silent, shuddering waves of grief, and where I ate my cold meals. I learned the geography of loneliness, mapping out the safe and unsafe corners of the city from behind a fogged-up windshield. One evening, while using the computers at the community college library, I stumbled upon a flyer for a local coding boot camp. It promised a new career in 6 months with a deferred tuition plan where you didn't pay until you got a job. It was a huge risk. The program was intensive, full-time. I would have to quit my jobs and live entirely off my last $100 and my credit card. But the alternative, a lifetime of washing dishes and sleeping in my car, was a far more terrifying prospect. Something inside me, that hardened core of resolve forged in the cold silence of my childhood, told me to jump. The boot camp was brutal. It was the hardest thing I had ever done. I was competing with people who had college degrees and backgrounds in tech. I was the girl who showed up in worn-out clothes and sometimes fell asleep during lunch break because she'd spent the night trying to fix a bug in her code in the backseat of her car, her laptop plugged into a power inverter. But I had something they didn't: desperation. This wasn't just a career move for me, it was a lifeline. I worked relentlessly, staying late every night, asking questions, and absorbing everything I could. It was during this time that I met Marcus Vance. He was a guest lecturer, an angel investor who had built and sold 2 successful tech companies. He gave a talk on entrepreneurship and the power of solving real-world problems. His story resonated with me. He'd also come from a difficult background. After his lecture, I stayed behind, my heart pounding, and asked him a question about logistics optimization for small businesses, a problem I'd seen firsthand at the diner. He was intrigued by my question and my intensity. He saw the fire in my eyes, the raw hunger to succeed. Marcus became my unofficial mentor. He reviewed my code, gave me advice, and most importantly, he treated me like I had a brain. He saw potential where my own parents had only seen a burden. When I graduated at the top of my class, Marcus helped me get an interview at a promising startup. I aced it. The day I got the job offer was the day I finally moved out of my car. I found a tiny studio apartment, so small you could touch all 4 walls from the middle of the room. I bought a real mattress. That first night, lying in a real bed, in a room with a door I could lock myself, I cried for hours. They weren't tears of sadness, but of overwhelming relief. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time since my 18th birthday, I felt safe. I poured everything into my career. I was the first one in the office and the last one to leave. I wasn't just working for a paycheck. I was building a fortress, brick by brick, around the terrified 18-year-old girl still huddled in the driver's seat of my memory. I climbed the ladder, moving from junior developer to team lead, then to project manager. I saved every penny I could, invested wisely on Marcus's advice, and after 8 years, I took the biggest leap of my life. With Marcus as my first investor, I left my job to start my own company, building the logistics software I had dreamed about years ago. The company, which I named Keystone, became my life's work. It grew slowly at first, then exploded. 15 years after that cold night on my parents' porch, I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. I was the CEO of a multi-million-dollar company. I had built a life, a real one, entirely on my own terms. Life settles into a rhythm when you work hard enough to create one. My rhythm was one of early mornings, productive days, and quiet evenings. My home was a minimalist, modern house with large windows overlooking the city, a city that once felt so hostile but was now the backdrop to my success. I had a small circle of trusted friends, my work, and the unwavering support of Marcus, who had become a true father figure to me. The past was a scar, healed over and faded. It was a part of my story, but it no longer defined my present. I hadn't spoken to my parents or my sister since the night I left. I'd never received a call, a letter, or even a text message asking if I was alive. Their silence was the final confirmation that their decision had been absolute. I had accepted it and moved on, building my fortress so high that I believed it was impenetrable. Then, on a crisp autumn Saturday, the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. I worked from home most weekends and my calendar was clear. I walked to the door, peering through the digital peephole on my security panel. My heart stopped. For a moment, my brain couldn't process the image. It was like seeing a ghost from a half-forgotten nightmare. Standing on my doorstep, looking aged and worn, were Arthur and Helen. My father's broad shoulders were stooped, his hair was completely gray, and his face was etched with lines of worry that hadn't been there before. My mother looked smaller, frailer, her hands clutching her purse with a white-knuckled grip. They looked like strangers, yet they were so horribly familiar. My first instinct was to do nothing, to leave them standing there until they gave up and walked away. Let them feel what it was like to be on the other side of a locked door. My hand hovered over the intercom button, my thumb tracing its cool metal edge. 15 years of repressed anger, hurt, and bewilderment swirled in my chest, a bitter cocktail that threatened to choke me. What did they want? After a decade and a half of absolute silence, what could possibly bring them to my door? How did they even find me? My company was public knowledge, but my home address was private, unlisted. They must have gone to some effort. Curiosity, that treacherous human impulse, warred with my instinct for self-preservation. A part of me, the part that still remembered being a little girl who craved their approval, needed to know. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I pressed the button. Can I help you? My voice was colder, firmer than I expected. On the screen, I saw them both jump, startled by the disembodied sound. My father squinted at the camera, then cleared his throat. Rose, is that you? The sound of him saying my name was jarring. It was a word I hadn't heard in his voice since he'd used it to cast me out. It's Arthur, your father. As if I could ever forget. My mother nudged him, whispering something. He continued, We need to talk to you, Rose. It's important. Every alarm bell in my head was screaming. This wasn't a social call. This wasn't an apology tour. These were people who only acted out of self-interest. They were here because they wanted something. The calculating, strategic mind that I'd honed building my company took. Letting them in was a risk, but turning them away without knowing their purpose felt like a missed opportunity, an opportunity to finally understand and perhaps to close this chapter for good. Stay there, I said, my voice clipped. I disengaged the intercom and walked through my house, my footsteps echoing on the polished concrete floors. I paused in front of a large mirror in the hallway. I looked at my reflection, a 33-year-old woman, poised and confident, dressed in simple but expensive loungewear. I was a world away from the terrified teenager in the baggy sweatshirt they had thrown away. I needed them to see that. I wasn't that girl anymore. I opened the front door. The cool air hit my face as I stood there, blocking the entrance. I didn't invite them in, I just watched them. My mother's eyes widened as she took in my appearance, my home visible behind me. I could see the flicker of shock, of disbelief. My father's expression was harder to read, a mixture of discomfort and a strange, grudging appraisal. You've done well for yourself, he mumbled, his eyes darting around. It wasn't a compliment, it was an assessment. What do you want? I asked again, crossing my arms. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. Rose, please, can we just come inside for a minute? We wouldn't be here if it wasn't an emergency. The word emergency hung in the air between us, an emergency for them. For 15 years, my entire life had been an emergency, and they hadn't cared. Now they stood on my custom-laid stone porch, asking for entry into the life they never thought I'd have, because of an emergency of their own. The irony was so thick I could taste it. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. 5 minutes, I said, my voice like ice. Then you're leaving. They shuffled past me into the foyer, their worn-out shoes looking tragically out of place on the gleaming floor. The ghosts were inside my fortress, and I knew, with a sinking certainty, that they were here to try and tear it down. They stood awkwardly in the center of my large, open-plan living room, looking completely out of place amidst the clean lines and modern art. It was as if two characters from a bleak, grainy photograph had wandered into a high-definition film. My mother, Helen, twisted the strap of her handbag, her eyes darting from my expensive sound system to the floor-to-ceiling windows. My father, Arthur, stared at a large abstract painting on the wall, his expression a mixture of confusion and resentment. It was clear this was not the future they had envisioned for me. They had expected failure, a cautionary tale they could tell their friends about a difficult daughter who couldn't make it in the real world. My success was an indictment of their judgment, and they wore it like an ill-fitting coat. I didn't offer them a seat or a drink. I stood with my arms crossed, maintaining a deliberate distance. Your 5 minutes started when you walked in, I said, my tone leaving no room for pleasantries. My father cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Rose, it's about Lily. Of course it was always about Lily. In the twisted ecosystem of my family, I was the disposable part of the food chain, while Lily was the creature to be protected at all costs. What about her? I asked, my voice flat. My mother finally broke her silence, her words tumbling out in a rushed, desperate stream. Her business, her little boutique, it's failing. She took out loans, big ones, and she wasn't responsible with the money. She's in a terrible amount of debt, Rose. The creditors are calling constantly. They're threatening to take everything. She looked at me, her eyes pleading. It was an expression I had never seen directed at me before. It was a look reserved for Lily, for when she broke a vase as a child or failed a test in high school. She made some bad choices, Arthur added gruffly, as if that excused everything. She was trying to build something for herself. She had a dream. A bitter laugh almost escaped my lips. A dream? Lily's dream was financed with loans and enabled by them, while my dream was forged in the freezing cold of a car and fueled by desperation. Bad choices have consequences, I stated simply. I learned that lesson when I was 18. It's time she learned it too. My father's face darkened. This is different. This could ruin her life. She could lose the house. My blood ran cold. What house? She lives with you. No, my mother whispered, looking down at her shoes. We co-signed the loan for her business. We put our house up as collateral. There it was, the rot at the core of their perfect family finally exposed. They had gambled their entire future on their golden child, and she had failed. Now the bill was coming due, and they had come to the bank they had closed 15 years ago. They're going to foreclose, Arthur said, his voice dropping. We're going to lose the house. We'll have nowhere to go. The raw, unfiltered desperation rolling off them was palpable. This was the emergency, not just Lily's failure, but their own. They were facing the exact fate they had sentenced me to without a second thought: homelessness. The irony was so profound, so poetically just, that for a moment I felt nothing but a cold, satisfying sense of vindication. They had sown the wind, and now they were reaping the whirlwind. And you came here, I said slowly, connecting the dots. You came to me for money. My mother started to cry, soft, hiccuping sobs. We didn't know who else to turn to, she wept. We saw an article about your company online. We saw how successful you are. You're our daughter, Rose. We're family. The word family coming from her lips was the greatest insult of all. Family doesn't lock a door on an 18-year-old girl. Family doesn't vanish for 15 years. Family doesn't reappear only when they need a bailout. I needed to know the full extent of the damage. My mind, ever the strategist, began to work. This wasn't just about money, it was about power. For my entire childhood, they held all of it. Now the tables had turned so dramatically it was almost dizzying. How much? I asked, my voice devoid of emotion. Arthur flinched, but he answered. $250,000, to cover the loan and some other debts she's racked up. $250,000. It was a staggering amount, but not an impossible one for me. To them, it was an insurmountable mountain. To me, it was a business expense. An idea began to form in the back of my mind, a cold, sharp-edged plan. This was my moment. This was the opportunity to not just say no, but to reclaim every single thing they had taken from me: my security, my peace of mind, my sense of worth. It wouldn't be about revenge in the fiery, destructive sense. No, my revenge would be quiet, precise, and absolute. It would be a contract, a transaction, the same way they had treated my eviction. I need to see the paperwork, I said. Every loan document, every default notice, every single piece of paper related to this mess. Bring it all to me tomorrow. They stared at me, a flicker of hope in their eyes. They thought this was me considering it. They thought their desperate plea had worked. They had no idea what I was truly planning. Get it all, I repeated, and then I will give you my answer. I walked to the door and opened it, a clear dismissal. As they walked out, dazed and clinging to that false hope, I felt a grim sense of purpose settle over me. The discovery was complete. Now the investigation would begin. The next day, as instructed, Arthur and Helen returned. They carried a worn cardboard box filled with files and envelopes, the physical manifestation of their desperation. They looked haggard, as if they hadn't slept. I led them not to my living room, but to my home office. It was a space designed for power and precision, dominated by a large mahogany desk, with one wall made entirely of glass, offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. I wanted them to be surrounded by the evidence of the life I had built in their absence. I sat in my high-backed leather chair, the seat of my authority, and gestured for them to place the box on the corner of the desk. They did so with the reverence of a sacrificial offering. I didn't open it in front of them. Thank you, I said coolly. I will have my lawyer review these. I'll contact you when I have made my decision. Hope and confusion warred on their faces. Your lawyer? My mother asked timidly. This is a family matter. No, I replied, my voice cutting through her delusion. This is a financial matter, and a significant one at that. I don't make decisions of this magnitude without professional counsel. The truth was, I didn't need a lawyer to understand the mess they were in. I spent the next 2 days poring over the documents myself. It was worse than they'd let on. Lily hadn't just taken out a business loan, she had maxed out credit cards, taken private loans at predatory interest rates, and had a history of unpaid supplier invoices. She hadn't just made bad business choices, she had been reckless, entitled, and utterly irresponsible. And my parents, blinded by their favoritism, had enabled it every step of the way, co-signing, giving her money they didn't have, until they had backed themselves into a corner of financial ruin. The total amount was closer to $300,000. They were on the verge of losing everything. After 2 days of meticulous review and quiet contemplation, I was ready. I called them and told them to come to my office, my actual office, downtown, on the top floor of the Keystone building. I wanted them to see the full scale of my world, the empire I had built from the ashes of the life they had torched. They arrived looking even more diminished than before, intimidated by the sleek corporate lobby, the silent, swift elevator, and the hushed professionalism of my employees. When my assistant showed them into my corner office, they looked like 2 mice in a lion's den. I had a contract laid out on the large conference table. It had been drafted by my actual lawyer, and it was ironclad. "Please sit," I said, gesturing to the chairs opposite me. I remained standing. "I have reviewed your situation," I began. "It's a comprehensive failure on multiple levels, but I am a problem solver. That is what I do for a living." I saw a glimmer of hope in their eyes, and I was quick to extinguish it. "I am willing to help you," I said, "but not in the way you think. I will not be giving you a gift. I will not be giving you a loan. I am offering you a one-time, non-negotiable transaction." I slid 2 copies of the contract across the table towards them. "Here are my terms." My mother reached for it, her hands trembling. My father just stared at me, his face grim. "Term 1, I said, my voice steady and clear, a CEO outlining a merger. "I will pay off the entirety of the debt, every penny. The business loan, the credit cards, the outstanding invoices. I will make you solvent. The foreclosure notice will be canceled." My mother let out a sob of relief. "Oh, Rose, thank you. I'm not finished." I cut her off. "Term 2, in exchange for this, you will sign over the deed to your house to me. It will become my property, free and clear. I will own it." Their faces fell. Shock replaced relief. "Our house?" Arthur choked out. "You want to take our house." "I'm not taking it," I corrected him. "You are selling it to me. The price is the exact value of your debt. I am, in effect, buying your financial freedom at the cost of your home. It's a fair market exchange." "But where will we live?" Helen whispered. "That brings me to term 3, I continued, my voice unwavering. "You will be allowed to live in the house. However, you will no longer be owners. You will be tenants. You will sign a standard rental agreement with me and why. O will pay me monthly rent." The room was silent save for my mother's ragged breathing. My father looked like he had been slapped. "Rent? You would charge your own parents rent? You stopped being my parents in any meaningful way 15 years ago," I stated coldly. "You are now prospective tenants. The rent will be set at the current fair market value for a property of that size in that neighborhood." I paused, letting the weight of my words sink in. "And finally, term 4, the most important one. This transaction is final and absolute. Once it is complete, you, Helen, you, Arthur, and you, Lily, will never contact me again for any reason. Not for money, not for holidays, not for medical emergencies, nothing. We will be strangers. If you attempt to contact me, it will be a breach of contract, the rental agreement will be terminated, and I will have you evicted. Do you understand?" I looked them both in the eye. This was my price. It wasn't just about the money. It was about reversing the power dynamic completely and permanently. They would be living under my roof, by my rules, forever reminded of the fact that their survival was dependent on the daughter they had thrown away. They would have their security, but they would lose their pride, the very thing they valued most. They would trade their home to save it, and in doing so, they would cede all control to me. It was a checkmate. Now, I just had to wait and see if they would knock over their king. The silence that followed my pronouncement was the most profound I had ever experienced. It was heavier than the oppressive silence of my childhood home, deeper than the lonely silence of my car on those first nights. It was the sound of 2 worlds colliding, the one where they were in charge and the one where I held all the cards. My father, Arthur, was the first to break. A deep, guttural sound of rage escaped his lips. He slammed his hand on the polished table, the sound echoing through the vast office. "This is insane," he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "This is blackmail. You want to humiliate us. You want to lord this over our heads for the rest of our lives." "No," I replied calmly, my composure unshaken by his outburst. "You misunderstand. I don't want to lord anything over you. That would require an ongoing relationship, which is precisely what I am terminating. I am offering you a solution. A permanent one. You are facing homelessness. I am offering you a home. You are facing financial ruin. I am offering you solvency. The price is your pride and my permanent absence. Given what your pride cost me, I consider it a bargain." My mother, Helen, just stared at the contract, tears streaming down her face and onto the legal paper. "How can you be so cruel, Rose?" she whispered. "We're your family." That word again. "You taught me everything I know about the value of family," I said, my voice hardening. "You taught me that familial bonds are conditional. You taught me that when a person becomes a burden, you cut them loose. I am simply applying the lessons you taught me. This is the business of survival. Your survival, not mine." "I am already fine." I let them sit with that, the truth of it hanging in the air between us like a guillotine. Arthur opened his mouth to argue again, but the fight seemed to drain out of him. He looked at Helen, at her quiet desperation, and then he looked around my office at the tangible proof of my power. He was a foreman who respected strength, and for the first time he was seeing mine. He finally understood. There was no negotiation. There was no appeal to emotion that would work. I had built a fortress around my heart just as I had built one for my business, and its walls were unbreachable. "You have 24 hours to decide," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "My lawyer's contact information is on the front page of the agreement. If you choose to accept, you will meet him tomorrow to sign the papers. He will handle the transfer of funds to your creditors and the deed transfer. The first month's rent will be due on the 1st of next month." I stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "If I don't hear from your lawyer, I will consider the offer rejected, and I will instruct my assistant to block your numbers and email addresses. You will not get a second chance." They left my office in a daze, the contracts clutched in my mother's hand. I watched them go, feeling not triumphant but empty. This wasn't a victory lap. It was the closing of a painful, infected wound. The procedure was necessary, but it still hurt. The next 24 hours were agonizing. I tried to work, but my focus was shattered. A part of me expected them to refuse to choose their pride over their security. Another, more cynical part of me knew they would take the deal. They were survivors, just like me. They had simply always survived at someone else's expense. Late the next afternoon, I got the call from my lawyer. "They're here, Rose," he said. "They've agreed to the terms. They're signing everything." I closed my eyes and let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 15 years. It was done. A week later, the transactions were complete. The debts were paid. The house I grew up in, the house from which I had been exiled, was now legally mine. My lawyer mailed them a copy of the signed rental agreement and a welcome packet, the kind a property management company sends to new tenants. It included information on how to pay rent online and who to call for maintenance requests. The first of the month arrived. I checked my bank account and there it was, a deposit for the exact amount of the rent transferred from my father's bank account. It was the most surreal and validating moment of my life. The debt wasn't just financial anymore. For 18 years, they had provided me with food and shelter, a debt they claimed I owed them. Then they had cast me out, creating a new debt, one of pain, abandonment, and trauma. Now, that debt was settled. The transaction was complete. I owned their home, and they were paying me for the privilege of living in it. They had their security, and I had my peace. I never heard from them directly again. The silence I had once dreaded became my most prized possession. The ghost at my door had been dealt with, not by banishing it, but by buying the haunted house and changing all the locks. The months that followed the signing of the contract were characterized by a profound and cleansing silence. The rent payment arrived in my account on the 1st of every month, an automated, impersonal transaction that was the only remaining link between my world and theirs. There were no calls, no emails, no desperate attempts to renegotiate the terms of our new reality. They held up their end of the bargain, and in doing so, they gave me the one thing I had always craved from them: nothing. This absence of contact was more comforting than any apology could ever have been. An apology would have been a plea for forgiveness, another attempt to take something from me, absolution. But the silence, the clean, contractual distance, was a form of respect. It was an acknowledgement of the boundaries I had set and the power I now wielded. My life continued on its upward trajectory. Keystone secured a major international contract, and I found myself traveling, expanding my business and my horizons in ways my 18-year-old self could never have imagined. I was featured in business magazines, asked to speak at conferences, and I continued to mentor young entrepreneurs through a program Marcus and I had established. I was building a legacy, one based on integrity, hard work, and solving problems, the very antithesis of the chaotic, destructive entitlement that had defined my family. About a year after the agreement, my lawyer contacted me. "Rose, something you should know. The tenants at your property reported a maintenance issue, a plumbing leak." My lawyer handled all communication, acting as the property manager so I wouldn't have to. The plumber went over and fixed it. He said the person who let him in was a young woman who seemed quite distressed. Lily, I believe. I felt a brief, distant pang of something that might have once been concern. Lily, the golden child, the catalyst for my parents' downfall, was still living there. Still a burden, only now she was my tenant's burden. The rent was being paid by Arthur, but the house was still crowded with their collective failures. I approved the plumbing repair invoice without a second thought. It was a business expense, nothing more. The house was an asset on my balance sheet, a property I now owned. The people inside were just occupants. Their dramas, their distress, it was no longer my concern. My fortress had held. The silence they had imposed on me 15 years ago had been their weapon of abandonment. The silence I imposed now was my shield of peace. Years passed. The monthly rent payments never faltered. I sometimes wondered what their lives were like. Did my father still work in construction, his body aching but his pride forcing him to continue? Did my mother find solace in her community, telling some edited version of her life story that painted her as a victim? And Lily, did she ever get another dream? Or was she trapped in the wreckage of her first one, living off the charity of parents who were now, themselves, living on my charity? I never sought out the answers. To do so would be to reopen a door I had permanently closed, sealed, and soundproofed. The need to know had been replaced by the freedom of not knowing. One day, I was having lunch with Marcus. He had been my rock through it all, the only person who knew the entire story. He raised his glass to me. "To you, Rose," he said, his eyes filled with a warmth that felt more paternal than anything Arthur had ever shown me. "You didn't just build a company. You built a life on your own terms. You faced your past, and you didn't just conquer it, you restructured it." He was right. I hadn't destroyed them. I had simply reorganized the family structure into a business arrangement, the only language they seemed to understand. They were no longer a source of pain, but a line item in my real estate portfolio. They were an investment that paid a steady, if emotionally insignificant, dividend each month. The silence they had left me with on my 18th birthday was a void. The silence that now filled my life was a sanctuary. It was the sound of peace, of strength, of a future that was entirely, and finally, my own. And it was the most beautiful sound in the world.